Professor Namyong Lee's editorial, long, in Superintendent of Education Elections. Without party nomination under the Public Official Election Act, we must choose experts who have published regular papers in top-tier archival journals to lead educational reform in the AI era. Elections for superintendents of education in Seoul and other regions are, by law, elections in which political party nominations are fundamentally excluded. This means that the substantive competence of each individual candidate must be evaluated directly and transparently. In particular, a superintendent of education in the era of artificial intelligence, AI, is not merely an educational philosopher, but a top-level professional who must redesign, operate, and rigorously demonstrate the outcomes of education systems at the scale of a nation or a major city. The 2026 budget of the Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education amounts to approximately KRW 10.9422 trillion. The number of students is estimated to be around 810,000. Even a simple calculation shows that public educational resources exceed KRW 13 million per student per year. Budgets and policy interventions of this magnitude cannot be governed by goodwill or appealing rhetoric alone. Any education policy that cannot clearly explain what was introduced, why it was introduced, how much was invested, and which indicators improved, and by how much must inevitably be regarded as a failed policy. In this context, it is entirely reasonable to require that the most important qualification for a superintendent of education be proven experience in publishing a regular paper in a top-tier archival journal. This requirement is not intended to showcase academic pedigree or career prestige. Rather, it is a minimum criterion for determining whether a candidate possesses the capacity to design and validate education policy using scientific and statistical methods. Individuals who have successfully published a top journal paper over a period of approximately 3 to 6 years have demonstrably passed through the full research process: hypothesis formulation, variable definition, data collection, statistical validation, examination of falsifiability, and explicit articulation of research limitations. Whether or not a candidate has undergone this process directly affects the quality of judgment in educational administration and policy making. The essence of education in the AI era is not knowledge transmission, but the management of judgment quality. As artificial intelligence is introduced in earnest into educational settings, the essence of education is shifting from knowledge transmission to the management of judgment quality. The more critical questions are no longer simply what to teach, but what to measure, whether those measurements are reliable, accurate, and fair, whether algorithms amplify bias and inequality, and how student data security and ethical standards are ensured. Education in the AI era is not merely about introducing AI tools into classrooms, but about redesigning curricula, from kindergarten through primary and secondary education to universities and graduate schools. In the AI era, education must move away from rote memorization toward problem-solving oriented learning. In particular, it must transition from mechanical, drill-based instruction to education that emphasizes creative problem definition, modeling, and analytical reasoning. Scientific policy design requires clear metrics, causal reasoning, and accountability. To design such education policies, superintendents of education in Seoul and other regions must possess at least 3 essential capabilities. First, they must define clear and measurable indicators, including key performance indicators that can explain policy effects. Second, they must establish causal assumptions and control for confounding variables. Third, they must adopt an attitude of transparency, explaining failures through data rather than concealing them, and continuously improving subsequent policies based on evidence. These capabilities are deeply internalized only by those who have conducted rigorous academic research themselves, and they manifest not in rhetoric but in policy design, documents, and analytical results. Educational policy and system reform in Korea must be approached in a systematic and scientific manner. Korean students have consistently ranked among the top performers in international academic achievement assessments. In recent evaluations, they significantly outperformed OECD averages in mathematics, reading, and science, indicating that the foundational academic performance of public education in Korea is already very strong. However, educational reform in the AI era cannot be evaluated on average scores alone. The critical issues are system-wide performance factors, including disparities between schools, the widening of upper and lower-end distributions, variations in teacher capacity, and unintended consequences arising from digital transformation. Many teachers recognize the need for additional professional development in advanced digital competencies and AI utilization. This is not a matter of individual effort, but a national-level education system design challenge. Korea is also conducting a globally rare, large-scale experiment by introducing AI-based digital textbooks nationwide. Dozens of AI digital textbooks have been approved and deployed in classrooms. As a single policy initiative, this represents an exceptionally large-scale intervention. The larger the policy scale, the more essential it becomes to rely on verification rather than intuition. Reforms that cannot demonstrate whether effects exist, under what conditions they emerge, and to what extent they occur, may ultimately increase systemic risk rather than reduce it. The common denominator of advanced education reform is evidence-producing leadership. A review of education reform cases in advanced countries reveals a common pattern. Education policy is not treated as a political declaration or a one-time campaign, but as an ongoing process of evidence accumulation through experimentation and evaluation. Policy interventions in schools are assessed using randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental designs, and their effects are continuously validated. Within such a system, educational leadership must have a solid understanding of research design and statistical interpretation. Leaders must be able to distinguish which policies can legitimately be said to have effects, which studies cannot support causal claims, and which results are overstated. This competence does not arise from reading books or reports alone. It emerges from first-hand experience in designing complex research studies, receiving data-based criticism, and passing through rigorous peer review processes. For superintendents of education, top journal publications are not credentials, but safety mechanisms. For superintendents of education in Seoul and elsewhere, experience in publishing top journal papers is not a matter of credentials, but a critical safety mechanism. The greatest risks in AI-based education are twofold. First, that technology adoption may inadvertently exacerbate educational inequality and bias, and second, that enormous budgets may be invested in policies whose effectiveness is unclear. To mitigate these risks, superintendents must approach policy decisions from a quasi-experimental design perspective. The establishment of comparison groups, phased implementation, interpretation of effect sizes, and assessment of internal and external validity are not optional. They are essential. Such capabilities cannot be acquired through lectures or short-term training programs. Only those who have personally written academic papers, faced critical peer review, and endured cycles of revision and rejection can truly develop these skills. Accordingly, candidates for Superintendent of Education must be asked specific questions. What was the research hypothesis? How were key variables defined? How were data collected? And how was bias addressed? How were statistical results interpreted? To what extent are the findings generalizable? And what were the limitations of the study? Candidates who cannot answer these questions are likely to govern education in the AI era based on intuition or personal experience rather than evidence. In such a scenario, Korea's education system risks serious failure in the AI age. The issue is no longer elite high schools or prestigious universities, domestic or international. Conclusion: Korea's education system is already operated at an advanced level. At the same time, it is undergoing a large-scale transition to digital textbooks, making the demand for precision in educational reform greater than ever. Global best practices consistently point to one conclusion: education reform is not completed through goodwill or slogans, but through the capacity to produce verifiable evidence. Educational reform is fundamentally dependent on the strong and competent leadership of the Superintendent of Education. Therefore, requiring experience in publishing regular papers in top-tier archival journals, in Superintendent of Education elections in Seoul and elsewhere, is by no means excessive. It is the minimum qualification necessary to pursue educational reform in the AI era safely and responsibly. A general love for education alone is not sufficient. For reference, Professor Namyong published a regular paper in September 1997 in one of the world's most prestigious academic journals, IEE Transactions on Software Engineering, entitled An Empirical Study of Software Reuse with Special Attention to ADA, and has published approximately 600 Korean and English academic papers overall. Citizens of Korea, we must elect genuine experts who can truly safeguard and advance our nation. Thank you for reading Professor Namyong Lee's editorial, Long,